We are the Ministry of the Real Truth, and we are bringing you part 2 of Noah's Ark and the Ziusudra epic, Sumerian Origins of the Flood Myth, by Robert M. Best. We are looking at Chapter 3, Mountain or Mound, and there is a quote here: "Too much amplifying things that be but small, making mountains of molehills." John Fox, Book of Martyrs, 1570. Stories about the near destruction of humanity by a great flood can be found all over the world. Many of these stories differ greatly in their details, but some stories, especially from the ancient Near East, are similar to the story of Noah. One of the peculiar elements in these Noachian stories is the grounding of the hero's boat on top of a mountain. There has been much discussion about the possible identity and location of the mountain. In recent years it has become customary to identify as Mount Ararat, the mountain of the apes, in the original ancient very old Tav Asherat Brita or Genesis, possibly in Armenia. In recent years it has become customary to identify as Mount Ararat, the mountain in eastern Turkey called Agridag by the Turks and Masis by the Armenians. This mountain has been linked to the flood story only since the 11th century CE, the result of a misreading of the mountain of Ararat in Genesis 8:4. Frequent references to Mount Ararat has led many people to assume that the general area where the boat grounded was already established, but the grounding place is far from certain, and as we shall see, Noah's barge did not ground on a mountain. According to the conventional interpretation of the Genesis version of Noah's story, the sea level rose for 150 days until it covered the tops of the mountains and then subsided for another 150 days. It is easy to prove that this is physically impossible. The local sea level can rise several feet for a few hours during a hurricane, but if the sea level rose to the 16,946 foot peak of Mount Ararat for 150 days, the sea would have to rise approximately 16,946 feet all over the planet Earth. That would require about 630 million cubic miles of additional water, weighing 3 billion tons of these quintillion tons. That is an enormous volume of water. The oceans would have to triple in volume in only 150 days and then quickly shrink back to normal. Where would 630 million cubic miles of water go during the second 150 days? There is nowhere an ocean can drain to, because the oceans already fill the low places. There is no geological evidence that the ocean basins that now exist formed in only 150 days. The excess water could not evaporate into the air because it would still be there, and it is not. So it would be in the clouds, wouldn't it? That's what it's talking about. It has been long known that rain clouds cannot possibly hold even a tenth of 1% of the water required by the conventional interpretation of the flood story. Soroka and Nelson calculated that 3 quintillion tons of water vapor would make the Earth's atmosphere pressure about 840 times higher than it is now, and sunlight would not reach the surface of the ground. Such an atmosphere would be incompatible with life as we know it. If a smaller mountain was selected, say 1/3 the height of Mount Ararat, 1 quintillion tons of water would still have to appear and disappear. If the oceans rose 8,600 feet to cover the mountain, per Omar Gudrun, that is often identified as the Mount Nisir, sometimes spelled Nimush, of Gilgamesh, 140, then 1.5 quintillion tons of water would have to appear and disappear in 300 days. A mountain covering deluge lasting 300 days implies a worldwide deluge, but a worldwide mountain covering deluge is impossible. Attempts to find physical evidence to link the Genesis flood to floods in other parts of the world have completely failed, in spite of efforts by the most capable and optimistic minds in their search for evidence of a global flood. Woodward failed, Buckland failed, Prestwich failed, Wright failed. It is clear now that the evidence they were searching for simply does not exist. Apart from several physics problems of disposing of 3 quintillion tons of water and the improbability of the animals surviving sub-freezing temperatures on a high mountain, there are numerous improbabilities and practical difficulties implied by grounding on a mountain. These are discussed further in Chapter 13 and by several authors who have proved that grounding on a mountain would be impossible. The high mountains nearest to Shuruppak, where Noah lived, are the Zagros Mountains, east of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. The highest peak and smaller mountains in the Zagros range are not visible more than 155 miles from an observer 16 feet above the ground because of the curvature of the earth. Looking east from the Euphrates River, the Zagros Mountains are beyond the horizon, and Noah could not have seen them before the flood unless he travelled east of the river. The Armenian Ararat Mountains to the north are also beyond the horizon. Ancient mistranslations. It is commonly assumed that Noah could see mountains being flooded because the ark reportedly landed on one. But what is the evidence that the ark landed on a mountain? The Hebrew word ha, plural harem, plural possessive hare, translated as mountains in Genesis 7:20 and 8:4, can also mean hills, and is so translated in many other places in the Old Testament, including Genesis 7:19b of the King James Version, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. There are no mountains in the southern Tigris-Euphrates valley where Noah lived, only higher or lower hills on a flat alluvial plain. Noah could have seen hills being flooded in the Euphrates Valley, but not mountains. Gilgamesh 11:135 reads, "The tideway lay flat as a rooftop." Tidal flats are not found in mountains. Ha is traditionally translated as mountain because there was a mountainous region known as Ararat that has long been identified with the Armenian mountains in what is now eastern Turkey. A region called Urartu or Urartu by the Assyrians. This Ararat region was also mentioned in 2 Kings 19:37, Isaiah 37:38, Jeremiah 51:27, and by various Assyrian and Urartian kings. But if the land where Noah's barge grounded was not in a mountainous region, then it could not have been in Ararat or Urartu. Ancient scribes who wrote that the barge grounded in the mountains of Ararat made a mistake of identification because they confused 2 different journeys made by Noah's sons, one on water and one on foot. As discussed in Chapter 5, after the barge grounded, Noah's sons travelled on foot up the Tigris River to the base of Mount Judy, a 7,000 foot peak 17 miles northeast of the Tigris River, and within the great Ararat/Urartu region that surrounded Lake Van. Ancient storytellers mistakenly assumed that the ark had grounded on Mount Judy in the mountains of Ararat. The ambiguous Akkadian word for hill or mountain was shadu, plural shadanu, and is so used in the Gilgamesh epic. If the flood story was translated from Akkadian into Hebrew, shadu, hill, mountain, was probably translated as ha, hill, mountain, thus preserving the ambiguity. Shadu could mean a low hill only 10 feet high. Since the Akkadian and Hebrew versions use a word for mountain that could also mean hill, and the Zagros and Armenian mountains were beyond the horizon, it is doubtful that Noah had ever seen a real mountain. Mount Nisir or Nisir country. The word for hill mountain may have been even more ambiguous if the original flood story was written in Sumerian. The cuneiform sign for hill was the same in both Sumerian and Akkadian. In Sumerian, the sign was pronounced Kur. So maybe that's where that word Kurds comes from, right? The Kurds, that they were like people of these hills. In Akkadian, the same sign was pronounced Shadu. Kur in Sumerian, hill, country, foreign land. Shadu in Akkadian, hill, mountain. But Shadu did not have the same semantic range as Kur, and the sign was ambiguous in both languages. The Sumerian word Kur could mean hill, but could also mean foreign land or country, and is so used in the Sumerian text of the Ziusudra epic. In Sumerian, Ker seldom meant mountain. Hursag was the preferred word for mountain in Sumerian. In Akkadian, the Ker sign, this is probably it here, looks like 3 fish swimming in a fishbowl, right? Well, 3 fish. In Sumerian, Ker seldom meant mountain. Hursag was the preferred word for mountain. In Sumerian, in Akkadian, the Ker sign, read as Shadu, could mean hill, but it could also mean mountain. In Akkadian, the language in which the epics of Atrahasis and Gilgamesh were written. In Sumerian, the boat grounded in a Ker, meaning that the boat grounded in a foreign land or country could be read in Akkadian as the boat grounded on a mountain. When the Sumerian flood story was translated into Akkadian, the Ker sign was probably copied without change because it meant hill in both Sumerian and Akkadian. Hill may have been the word sense assumed by the translator, and hence there was no need to change the cuneiform sign during translation. However, the Ker sign read as Shadu in Akkadian could also mean mountain, which would open the door to mistaken interpretation. The section of the Ziusudra epic about the grounding of the boat is missing from the fragmentary Sumerian tablet, and therefore we cannot be certain that the Sumerian text used the word Ker for hill, but the Ker/Shadu sign is used repeatedly in the Akkadian text of Gilgamesh 11:140-144 in connection with the boat grounding, and therefore the Ker sign was probably also used in the Sumerian version. This is one more possible source of error if the flood story was originally written in Sumerian about a Sumerian king and later translated into Akkadian and still later into Hebrew. The grounding place given in Gilgamesh 11:140 is normally translated as a proper name, Mount Nisir, which is often identified as a mountain per Omar Gudrun in the Zagros range. This 8,600 foot mountain was mentioned in the annals of Ashur Nasir-pal II, 883 to 859 BC, of Assyria, but since it would have been physically impossible for the ocean to rise 8,600 feet all over the earth in 150 days, this mountain cannot be the place where the barge grounded. We should therefore look for an alternative reading of line 140 that would have been physically possible. This is readily done by interpreting Ker as a Sumerian rather than Akkadian word, i.e. land, country or hill, but not mountain. As discussed in Appendix A in this book, the place of grounding should probably be translated Nisir land or Nisir country. This may have referred to a general land area rather than a specific spot. The literal meaning of Nisir in this context is not certain. Nisir may have acquired its name from the root Nisirtu. With reference to localities, Nisirtu had the connotation of hidden, inaccessible, secluded, as in a fortified place. Hence, Nisir could have got its name from a secluded or restricted land area that was generally inaccessible. In the original story, the barge may have grounded on a sand bar or mud mound in an estuary that was inaccessible to shipping. This may explain why Noah was not rescued by sailboat when his barge sat for several weeks after it grounded. Well, look at the Bible story. There's nobody around to do that. That's according to the Bible story, right? The biblical version. Ancient storytellers wanted a place named for a specific grounding spot. Since there was no name for this spot in the received legend, the storytellers treated Nisir as a specific spot rather than the name of a broader land area, just as today people mistakenly write about Mount Ararat instead of the mountains of Ararat. Trying to find a specific grounding place in Mount Nisir is just as futile as trying to find the correct grounding place in the mountains of Ararat. Even if a specific mountain were clearly identified in a surviving version of the flood story, it would still not be the grounding place, because the barge could not have landed on a mountain, any mountain. However, there are other clues that suggest where the barge grounded, and these are discussed in chapter 4 of this book. According to Genesis 7:19, all the high hills that were under the whole sky were covered by the waters. The word all is overly general, because Noah would have no way of knowing what was happening to all of the hills. Noah would have personal knowledge only of the hills that he could see. As several biblical commentaries have pointed out, Universal terms such as all are used in a limited sense. Elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, and the hills mentioned would be those with the range of Noah's visible horizon. The word high is also an ambiguous word. A mountain is high, but the roof of a house is also high on a different scale. The people living in a river valley that has annual inundations would want to clearly distinguish land that was flooded every year from high ground that normally escaped flooding. By definition, some of this high ground would be flooded whenever the river rose above the normal high water marks. The high hills mountains of Genesis 7:19 may have been the high ground in the Euphrates Valley that usually remained dry during annual inundations, but could have been flooded by unusually high water that overflowed the levees. Noah could have seen some of this high ground being flooded, but most of the high ground in the valley could have remained above the flood water without Noah being aware of it, especially high ground that was. And then there's 15 cubits as a local flood according to Genesis 7:20, etc., etc. Why the tip of a mountain? Josephus wrote, after the ark rested on top of a certain mountain. Why the top? Because if it landed further down, Noah would have seen the top of the mountain before the ark grounded, which could conflict with Genesis 8:4-5. In the 7th month, the ark came to rest. In the 10th month, the tops of the mountains were seen. But it is extremely unlikely that a boat would settle on the exact peak of the highest mountain. If the ark missed the exact peak by only a short distance, Noah would have seen the mountain before grounding, and the receding water would have washed the ark some distance down the side of the mountain before it grounded.